Welcome to Open Plaza Talks, created by the Hispanic Theological Initiative. Each episode focuses on a topic that matters to you, whether you're in the field, the academy, or the clergy. Today we bring you a conversation between Dr. Matthew Pettway and Dr. Elías Ortega on Dr. Pettway's new book, Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection. For more information about today's episode, please visit us at htiopenplaza.org.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to HTI Open Plaza. I am Elías Ortega-Aponte, and I serve as president of Meadville Lombard Theological School and professor of religion ethics and leadership. It is my pleasure today to have with us Dr. Matthew Pettway, who is assistant professor of Spanish at the University of South Alabama, where he also teaches in Africana studies. His work is marvelous and really fascinating, and I'm really excited to have this opportunity to speak with him and to introduce to you the work that he has done in this marvelous book titled Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, Manzano, Plácido, and Afro-Latino Religion. I think for all of us, the opportunity to think with a person as gifted as Matthew, right, who brings a conversation on a moment in Caribbean history that is connected not only to the potential, right, for revolutionary change, but also an affirmation of Black dignity in this moment, is filled my heart with pride and also hope for the moment and the work that we are doing today as a scholarly community and as folks who also participate in social movements and in faith communities across the nation. So welcome, Matthew, and I'm looking forward for this conversation. So as a way to get us started, please tell us a little bit about your intellectual genesis. Like, why do you do the work that you do in the ways in which you do it?
Well, thank you for having me, Elias. I'm happy to be here with the Hispanic Theological Initiative. I think with regard to my work, there are a lot of different events essentially that led me to where I am today. One thing my grandmother used to say that I didn't fully appreciate growing up in Detroit, going to these African-American Protestant churches was, I know that I know that I know. She would always say these sorts of things, and even though she was committed to Christianity, a particular Church of God in Christ interpretation of Christianity, she had a way of talking about the spiritual world that once I began to study Caribbean religions, I began to realize that her belief structure was in some way touched or influenced by or had I will call it more than residue. I'll say that it was African inflected on occasion. She would always talk about the ability of others to do harm. And she would use the word brujeria, but in English, right? So she had this awareness that she was navigating a spiritual landscape that was wrought with danger. And that in addition to praying, she had to be able to be discerning and to identify where harm might lie. Now, growing up, we thought, she's overbearing and, a little bit too religious. She was a minister. She would teach and preach at the house. So you have to imagine growing up in Detroit, we thought, man, when are we going to get an opportunity to leave the house and go to regular church like regular people? We'll be Christian. Just let us go to church like regular people. And that was the sort of thing that grandmother had a different type of vision. That was something that we grew up listening to her stories. We grew up listening to her activities as an itinerant preacher of sorts. And I want to say the mid to late 20th century. And I think once I came to graduate school, my intent was to do something that would connect me to people of African descent in Latin America. So I'd done the master's degree, but at the time, Michigan State University didn't have an apparatus in place for me to look at the Caribbean or Afro-Latin American populations. And so I studied what I could study. Once I decided to come back for the doctorate, I was introduced to Ada Ferrer's book, Insurgent Cuba. And I was struck, very well argued, very well written. I was struck by the role that people of African descent had played in Cuba in the 19th century. I thought, this is extraordinary. Without Cubans of African descent, Cuba would have never acquired its independence. Overwhelmingly, the soldiers that fought in the Cuban Wars for Independence, the 3 engagements ended in 1898, were of African descent, not only foot soldiers, but also people who were generals like Antonio Maceo and other members of his family. But I think when it comes to the project that became Cuban Literature and the Age of Black Insurrection, I initially really planned on doing an anti-racist critique of 19th century Cuban society, and I was interested to what extent it might be possible to write a history of Black Latinx, you might say today, or Afro-Latinx thought in Cuba in the 19th century, trajectory. I was interested in that. But I came to religion and spirituality in the process of reading Manzano's work, rereading his work after a trip to Cuba. And Cuba was the first time I came in more, I would say, direct contact with ritual priests. And my initial contact was coming from a background that my father was a convert to Islam, who was born here in Mobile, Alabama, where I live. But my grandmother, was a Christian all her life. Once again, that Christianity that I now think was inflected with some African ideas of spirit and cosmos. And so I was nervous initially. I thought, what am I doing, with this? And I would write about it in my journals. I think that the moment that my thinking began to shift about African-inspired spirituality really came when I was in Ghana, not Cuba. Outside Accra, I think we were in Cape Coast. We had gone to visit one of the slave dungeons on the coast. We went to Elmina, which the Portuguese erected in the 1480s after acquiring land through a series of agreements with the local rulers. And I stayed up the night prior. I had a roommate. We were staying in this hotel, and he fell asleep. I stayed up the night prior, and I cried all night. And I was crying for African Americans. I was crying for people of African descent that were pulled away from Africa. I felt the loss in my bones for the first time. I don't even know how much sleep I got. So I thought the next day I would be fine. Got to the slave dungeon the next day, and I remember a gesture by a young Ghanaian man who offered tissue to one of my colleagues, a dear friend of mine, Sonia Maria Johnson. And I just kind of looked at her and I said, Sonia, he's offering you, and I started to cry again. But it was a moving experience for me, and I began to try to put myself in the shoes. Frankly impossible, whether you're African American, Afro-Latinx, Latinx of indigenous descent, really impossible to put yourself entirely in the shoes of your ancestors. But we did a ceremony in remembrance of the sovereign of the ocean sea, of the ocean, Yemaya. And in the process of doing that, I'm calling it a ceremony. I'm not sure if it was strictly a ritual. It's when I began to imagine what things might have been like for an African woman, man or child, from their perspective, who would be their protector. And so I began to think of Yemaya then as a protector to Africans who are being torn from their homes to be bought and sold like chattel.
You are in good company. Manuel Zapata Olivella, right, a Colombian writer, when he was working on his, for many of us, his magnum opus, Chango El Gran Putas, he actually narrated a very similar experience. He couldn't quite finish the novel until he spent a night in one of the dungeons. And he has this vision, right, of talking to ancestors, passing by, right, walking into the boats, and talking with him. And after that, right, the novel came into fruition. I think for many of us, right, that native spirituality, indigenous spirituality, ancestral work, right, is central to the work that we do in our cosmology. And at times, we might speak about it openly, other times it's in the background, right, but it shapes the work that we do, right? It moves us intellectually to explore particular questions, right, particular figures, and kind of give us some insight, right, into some of the hidden gem of knowledge that is there, right, if we only listen carefully. I think something that I would love then for us to have a conversation is the figures, right, that you discuss. Manzano and Plácido, for example, are two figures that when folks think of Caribbean literature, they don't oftentimes come to the fore, right, as precursors, right, of this kind of Afro-Latinidad in thinking and articulating, right, a liberationist projects within, the Black Caribbean. So if you can tell us a little bit about these figures, right, and your particular interest in it, and how they actually start working, right, into your work.
I think that when most folks who study, Cuban literature, or I think even folks who look at Hispanophone Caribbean literature, they may think of some of the more famous figures like Nicolás Guillen, Nancy Morejon, who really builds on Guillen's emphasis on African descended culture and does something extraordinary with it, with poems like Mujer Negra, Ojo de Legua, the eyes of a Legua, who is the spirit of the crossroads, or Black Woman, the other poem. But what we don't often, we're never really taught that prior to Nicolás Guillen, that Nicolás Guillen no surgió de la nada, que no es un poeta que un día nació poeta y ya empezó a hacer la cosa y changed the world. When I was coming up, you could only find Guillen, and then, in the anthologies, and then a little bit later you would find Morejon. Morejon was placed also there. But I wanted to get beyond this notion of the Black writer as garnish, as a kind of a part of a broader assortment, and to ask about the roots of Spanish American literature. How can we redefine Spanish American literature? I wanted to look at unlikely places, and I also wanted to do work that would allow me to push past anti-racist critique. I wanted to do something, Elías, que nunca se había hecho antes. That was really important to me, something that had not been done before. So Juan Francisco Manzano is important for not only Cuban literature and Hispanophone Caribbean literature, but Spanish American and Latin American literature more broadly, because to our knowledge, he's the only person of African descent in Spanish America to write a slave narrative himself, not as told to, but something that he authored himself. So it's very important for that reason. His slave narrative, which was often known as La Autobiografía, became the foundation, actually, for Cuban narrative. And there's authors, prior to myself, have made that point, like William Luis, in a very helpful way. But Juan Francisco Manzano was also important in addition to that, because when you look at his work through a pluriversal prism, an inclusive prism, you begin to realize that in addition to Catholicism, there are African ideas of spirit and cosmos. He was born in 1797, to the best of our knowledge, and died in 1853, apparently of natural causes. And he first began to publish in 1821. So he publishes one of the first books of poetry, collections of poetry, poemarios, en la historia de Cuba. Eso es bien importante. Antes, cualquier otro poeta está publicando ya Manzano. So that's really important. His contemporary Plácido was born free. So I think of, for those who are not familiar with them but are more familiar with the States, I tend to think of Juan Francisco Manzano as a Cuban Frederick Douglass of sorts, though he published his slave narrative prior to Douglass in 1840 in England, in English translation, and Douglass publishes in 1845 his first of three narratives. Plácido, then, for heuristic purposes, Plácido would be something like Martin Delany, because he was born free and lived his life out as a free man. He was born in 1809. Plácido was distinguished by his color almost immediately, because his mother was a Spanish woman from Burgos, a northern part of Spain, a bit less touched by the African and Arab Muslim presence. I've been to Burgos, interestingly enough. Bien medieval la ciudad todavía. But
Since you mentioned that, I'm going to ask you for the audience that you can say a little bit of kind of the notion of castas, right, and how that kind of influenced the kind of discussion of race in the Caribbean. Because for some folks, right, it's complicated, right, to see the way in which whitening, right, embeds itself so hard, right, in Spanish American, Latin American, Asian categories, in which you always pushing against blackness, right, in very
that's right
ways.
That's right, and the Caribbean specifically. Some have argued that if, without talking about the Indo-Caribbean population, if you put aside the East Indian population for a moment, and you have the discussion that the debate is largely about black versus white, but Spanish American racial category didn't construct race in dichotomous terms as was in the United States. So we would have to go back very far to identify the whole notion of a black blood or white blood. We know that race is not a biological reality, that it is a social construct, which means it's a human invention and something that, that was created essentially. We can look to the late 15th century in Iberia, what would become Spain. We can look at the limpieza de sangre statues or purity of blood statues that initially did not talk about black blood or white blood, but instead Jewish blood, as if such a thing exists. No existe esa cosa, tal cosa no puede existir. And Muslim blood. And so what I like to explain to my students is that the Catholics were largely, not exclusively, but they were largely people that today will be identified as white. And once the Catholics defeat the last Africans and Arabs in Granada, they arrive in the New World, what became the New World, I should say, as conquerors. And that limpieza de sangre statue comes with them. Those laws come with them. But the language of black and white begins to take form with the enslavement of Africans and the attempts to enslave, the semi-servitude of indigenous people as well. So in the Caribbean, you have to think in terms of gradations rather than dichotomy, understanding that an intermediate level existed, the possibility of being something other than black, even if you're a person of African descent. So if one could claim a European ancestor, say, mi abuelo fue español, todo el mundo dice eso, mi abuelo fue español. Maybe everybody else in the family is of African descent, but mi abuelo, or, as is more common, la abuela, que la abuela se quedó, sí, mi abuela se queda en la cocina. So essentially what Plácido was dealing with is that he was considered al parecer blanco. He was white in appearance at birth, and I use that language in the book in order to highlight the fact that he was considered white in appearance, but he was a person who was raised within communities of African descent, according to his biographers, by his black grandmother, who, according to one of my sources, claims it was a formerly enslaved person. Very likely. His father was considered the 1/4 African, or to be a quadroon, essentially. But Plácido identified with African inspired culture. He went to carnival. He was involved at the Fiesta de Santos, or the Saints' feast days, which were very Africanized within black communities. And he identified politically against the notion that the mulatto should become white.
Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, Plácido has a number of poems that lampoon essentially this mulatto desire to become white. And so in the not only Spanish Caribbean, but in the Spanish American system, in terms of these gradations, what individuals are encouraged to do is to make an effort to become whiter and whiter. So you're looking for a partner that will guarantee that your children will be a little less brown. And Plácido didn't do that. Plácido fell in love with a beautiful black woman named Rafaela, who he named Fela, who died unfortunately in an epidemic, a cholera epidemic. That might sound very familiar. And later, when she passed, his wife was also a black woman. I found in the record a reference. We can't identify exactly who said it, but a reference to the fact that one of the reasons why he was resented is that he did not identify with his European ancestry. even though he had a relationship with his mother in the way that he was expected to. So Plácido has these poems where he makes fun of the so-called mulatto who wants to straighten his hair, or in spite of his wavy hair, perhaps in spite of his nose and his other features, claims to be white in plain view of everyone. And he says, he has a poem called Si Así no dices, you can't, essentially you can't throw rocks, when your house is made of glass.
That sounds really good. And it's true. And it has been a trope of conversation around the Afrocentric literature in the Caribbean, right? That conversation on the cost of whitening, right, and trying to be adopted into a white culture, right, as a political project and the counter-political project of resistance. I think something in your book that you really write eloquently about is the crossroads, right, and the way in which your poets articulate, right, that moment of what does it mean, both in terms of cosmology, right, but also ethics and politics would be at that crossroad. And you also make some connections, right, with the blues in the United States, the Delta blues and Robert Johnson. And I wonder if you can tell us more about that, and what do you find in that particular process of thinking through the crossroad?
Absolutely. I think the crossroads as a concept is extraordinarily important. One thing I would add with reference to what I was saying about race is that blackness was constructed at the nadir of degradation, the lowest point imaginable. So the flight from blackness was essentially what was incentivized in Spanish Caribbean society. And the law incentivized it in some important ways. So an individual could not study at a university if they were of known African ancestry, could not become a priest. They cannot become a college professor. There were only certain professions they could exercise. They had to carry freedom papers with them, those sorts of things. And so the escape from blackness, the flight from blackness, the ability to claim something other than black was incredibly incentivized. To talk about the crossroads, which is one of the central concepts of Cuban literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, I like to define terms that I typically think of la encrucijada, básicamente, la encrucijada, as the crossroads as a spirit that governs the meeting of disparate worlds. That the crossroads links spirit with flesh. It links divine power with human need. So with regard to the concept of the crossroads, we're not speaking about within a Judeo-Christian framework where one would say que yo voy a pedir a Dios that he saves me, right? Que me redima. No, the concept of the crossroads cannot be equated with the Judeo-Christian notion of redemption, particularly in Spanish American society, because Catholic theology that was in operation was a slave theology. And if we go back to the 15th century, we see very briefly that slave theology had the imprimatur of the church. And so people of African descent, I theorize essentially, were looking for a way to access power that might liberate themselves. The Yoruba-speaking ethnicities in West Central Africa are imported to Cuba, particularly the late 18th century. We see after the British siege of Havana and after the collapse of the Kingdom of Oyo in what is today Nigeria, we see large numbers of Yoruba-speaking African ethnicities brought to Cuba against their will. And the notion of the spirit of the crossroads, or a shu, also known as a legua, and Haitian Vodou legba. In Cuba, a legua, a chu, or legua, I refer to him typically as a legua, is a spirit that is, unlike Christianity, ambivalent but not evil. And so the dichotomy of good and evil also doesn't exist in quite the same way within what we might call an African-Cuban moral universe. Also at the crossroads, another thing that was important for Manzano. So Manzano was essentially looking to escape slavery circa 1817, somewhere around 1817, so that he could arrive in Havana. And he's looking to do so because he's been charged by his mother to acquire his own freedom. And once he acquires his own freedom, to become a father to his siblings. All this is after his own father has passed away. This was really moving to me to read this and to be able to write about this. So Manzano, I would say, was at the crossroads on at least 4 different occasions in his life. And this is just according to the record, right? So if the crossroads is that spiritual entity that governs the meeting of disparate worlds and requires the individual, when the road bifurcates, to make a decision, Manzano had to make such a decision on his escape to Havana on horseback in 1817. He had to make that. Found himself at the crossroads again in 1838. His mother had asked him to become a father to his siblings, and in order to become a father to his siblings, he needed to use the money that his family had, his inheritance, to purchase his freedom. Well, he wasn't able to do that because the mistress or the enslaver took that money from him, and so then he escapes on horseback, presumably one of the horses his family owned, actually, to Havana. In 1838, then, he's still in the process of trying to free his brother. And he publishes this poem called Un sueño a mi segundo hermano. I believe, though it's a little difficult to demonstrate because the historical record is spotty, right, somewhat fragmented, that he's doing so because he wants to raise funds to liberate his brother. We don't know what happened, essentially, with that project. But in 1839, he meets a dynamic young African-descended poet who by that time has already become perhaps the most famous person of African descent in Cuba, and that's Plácido. So in 1839, he's at the crossroads once again because he has an opportunity for aesthetic collaboration with Plácido. And finally, Manzano found himself at the crossroads in 1844 when the choice was either to join an anti-slavery movement that had as its objectives the abolition of slavery and possibly the idea of erecting or constructing a government of blacks and mulattoes on the island, or African descendants on the island. So he had to decide, would he swear the oath or would he abjure the oath? So all of this I found this absolutely extraordinary to look at. Imagínate tú, Manzano's engaging the saints, essentially, right? So in the saints in Catholicism they open the way. The saints are the intermediaries between God and man. One can say a prayer to San Antonio, for example. So of all the saints that Manzano mentions in his book, he mentions the saint that has been transculturated or parallel with the spirit of the crossroads. And that's San Antonio, who's parallel with El Egua in the Cuban tradition. So his understanding of the saints, para mí, la verdad que era muy interesante, la manera en la cual él piensa y comunica con los santos, because the saints reward devotion and punish neglect. For Manzano, there's a principle of reciprocity there. And what was so interesting is that African cosmologies pose a challenge to the logic of European philosophy, because European philosophy is based on the principle of non-contradiction. So Manzano could engage this African spirit of the crossroads and at the same time, as he did, go to Mass, be baptized in the church, marry in the church, and receive the last rites when he died.
So Matthew, thank you for that really rich conversation and thinking through the crossroad and put it in the context of a life of an author, right? The decisions that he's making as he's thinking about, his poetic with an intention, right? To free his brother, right? To create a new consciousness of his own experience. And I wonder if it would be possible for you to share, right, a little bit of one of his poems with us, right? For us to get a flavor, right, of Manzano's poetics.
Absolutely. I'm going to share a sonnet that Manzano published in 1837 called 30 años. Primero voy a leer el soneto en español, no demasiado rápido, y después una traducción que hice. Cuando miro al espacio que he corrido, desde la cuna hasta el presente día, tiemblo y saludo la fortuna mía, más de terror que de atención movido. Sorpréndeme la lucha que he podido sostener contra suerte tan impía, si tal puede llamarse la porfía de mi infeliz ser, al mal nacido. 30 años ha que conocí la tierra, 30 años ha que en gemido estado, triste infortunio por doquier me asalta, mas nada es para mí la cruda guerra, que en vano suspera he soportado, si la calculo, oh Dios, con la que falta. 30 years, Juan Francisco Manzano. When I gaze upon the course I have run, since infancy to the present day, I tremble and meet my destiny, troubled more by terror than by contemplation, astonished by the struggle that I have endured against such an ungodly fate, if I may name the quarrel thus of my ill-fated soul of lowly birth. 30 years I have known this planet, 30 years since, in a state of lament, miserable misfortune assails me from all sides, but nothing is like the cruel war I have fought yearning in vain, if I compare it with what is to come.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think it's fascinating for us to hear, right, the particular ways in which the experience, right, is narrated, right, for the moment, right, in making sense of where he is, right, as a person, but also where he hopes to go. Mm-hmm. In this book, right, there's so much richness for us to think about. And one of the concerns that I think at times happens in the general public is that they wonder, why do we study these moments that seem so obscure, right, in the imagination of people? But I think you can actually tell us, right, what is the importance, right, the significance of thinking, right, of 19th century Cuba and this particular, right, Black freedom struggle in a nation, right, in the Caribbean, that is also connected globally to other parts of not only in Europe but also in the United States, right, in emerging nations, right, this particular consciousness. And I wonder, right, in your way of thinking this project, right, and now that you have laid it down and is seeing the world as a published book, what is the significance that you are seeing, right, in the questions that you were asking then of 19th century Cuba in these particular figures that you can see in this particular contemporary moment in which we are now?
Mm-hmm. I appreciate the question. I think that when we think about the birth of, particularly here in the United States, when we think about the birth of the Americas, we think about the United States, though we know that it wasn't really until the 17th century that you have a permanent English settlement in Jamestown. Well, prior to the permanent English settlement in Jamestown, almost a century prior, actually more than that, you have Africans being brought to the Caribbean against their will. So prior to the conquest of Mexico, the invasion of Mexico, 1519, the conquest of Mexico, of the Mexica by Cortés, you have Velázquez, right, in Cuba. So really the Caribbean is really the first crucible for the construction of what a racialized society will look like in the modern era. And so I tend to think about slave societies, not as a relic of a bygone barbaric past, but I think of them as an archaic authoritarian regime that doesn't require much subterfuge to legitimate its power, right? Slave societies don't make a pretense to universal individual rights like our societies do. Slave societies die, but they do not decompose. Slave societies die, but they don't decompose. So even though we had the abolition of slavery in the United States in 1865, and later we had a constitutional amendment to abolish it, we know that amendment, the 13th Amendment, has that loophole, right? And Cuba is 1886 that slavery is abolished because of that war that African descendants fought, those wars for independence, right? And Brazil is 1888. But former slave societies forsake one framework of legitimacy for another. They substitute one technology of power for another. The same articles of faith endure in spite of that. The belief in racial hierarchy, a doctrine of white supremacy, and an unquenchable thirst for labor that can be exploited and is therefore disposable. Slave societies require silence as a staple of the rhetorical diet. Social positions are considered divinely ordained. Education is a luxury of the choice few. Critical thinking, I like to remind myself that critical thinking is anathema to social cohesion within slave societies. Critical thinking is the last thing that an authoritarian regime wants to do. And what does the authoritarian regime do? What does the authoritarian regime do? It makes a mockery of local rule. The election of your mayor doesn't matter. So I think about my home state, and I think about the former regime there. Not the current governor, but the former regime there, where Flint and even my own city, Detroit, didn't have local rule. So it means there was no democracy there in these cities that are largely of African descent. And so I think for ourselves, as we look back, the crossroads that we find ourselves at, and this is how I see it, others may see it somewhat differently, but I think that we have two choices. The road, once again, is bifurcating, and it's either going to be anti-racist democracy or authoritarianism. I don't think that we have middle ground. And so we find ourselves in a position where we need broad-based solidarity among members of the global majority, whether you're talking about indigenous peoples fighting to keep pipelines off their lands, whether you're talking about African-American communities fighting extrajudicial violence or violence sanctioned by the state, whether you're talking about Latinx people concerned with Central Americans being locked in cages, quite frankly. I mean, all these things respond, to my mind, to the logic of an archaic authoritarian regime of slave society. That this society in some ways seems to be tossing aside the pretense to universal rights. And we got to fight like hell. Yeah.
Yes, we do. And I wonder, what is the role of the poet, right, in this moment, right? The poet and the intellectual and those who speak, right, the general public to uncover, right, that reality and put it in a way that is succinctly, right, in front of us, right, so that we don't forget of the moment, right, and live into the experience of the crossroad with a passion, right, for a different future, Thank you, Matthew. I think this has been a very rich conversation, and there are so many other things that I would love to ask you. But we have an opportunity, right, in the near future, right, to continue this conversation. And for the folks in HTI and Open Plaza, there's been a conversation with Matt Pettway, who is the author, right, of Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, Manzano, Plácido, and Afro-Latino Religions. And this book is part of the Caribbean Studies series at the University Press of Mississippi, and is already available for purchase. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that you all continue to be safe during these times.
Thank you, Elías.
This has been an HTI production. For more information, visit us at htiopenplaza.org. The Hispanic Theological Initiative provides Open Plaza as a public service. The views expressed by the guests are their own. Their appearance on this program or any reference to a specific product or entity they represent does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by HTI.